They stripped the weapon from her hands before she could even argue, the cold metallic weight of the pistol disappearing into the army officer's possession with a clipped order she had no choice but to obey. Rules were rules, they told her, and this part of the training exercise was meant to simulate what would happen if a soldier were caught behind enemy lines, disarmed, and left with nothing but instinct. She had nodded once, her jaw tight, her eyes narrowing with the quiet fire of someone who did not intend to let humiliation write the end of her story. The 5 men assigned against her had grinned, exchanging cocky remarks under their breath as they circled her in the dust-filled hangar. They thought it was a joke, a stacked deck in their favor. She was barely over 5 feet 7, lean, not bulky like the broad-shouldered specialist they had chosen for the test. But there was a sharpness in her frame, a coiled energy hidden in the way she planted her feet, and though she kept her face calm, her mind had already begun calculating distances, weights, angles of impact. The instructor called for the timer to start. 83 seconds later, when the echo of fists and bodies hitting the concrete finally stilled, those same 5 men lay groaning on the floor, while she stood above them, chest rising and falling, her bare hands steady, her eyes colder than steel. It began with anticipation crackling in the air like static. They thought they would overwhelm her in a rush, 5 against 1, confident that sheer numbers would crush any chance of resistance. The first man lunged without hesitation, aiming to wrap his arms around her and pin her to the ground. She let him come, tilting her body just enough that his momentum overextended him. In one swift move, she trapped his arm, dropped her weight, and rolled her shoulder into his chest. The impact sent him sprawling sideways, the air knocked clean from his lungs. She didn't linger, didn't give the others a chance to press in. Her boot pivoted, her eyes already on the second man charging in from her blind side. He swung a wild fist, sure he could stun her with a single blow, but she ducked beneath the arc, her elbows snapping upward with brutal precision into the soft cartilage of his nose. The crunch echoed sharply, and the man staggered backward with blood pouring between his fingers, his confidence evaporating into pain. By then the others realized this wasn't a demonstration they could laugh through. Their smirks hardened into gritted teeth, and they spread to surround her more carefully. 3 left, circling like wolves, each waiting for a mistake, a break in her balance. She didn't give them one. Instead, she shifted her stance, grounding herself, her breathing even. The third man tried a feint, darting forward before pulling back, testing her reactions. She didn't fall for it, didn't chase the bait, only adjusted her center of gravity with small, deliberate steps. The fourth man grew impatient, his voice cracking as he shouted for them to go in together. They surged at once, 2 bodies hurtling forward, fists raised, legs pumping. She chose her target instantly. Her hand shot out, catching the wrist of the first, twisting sharply until his own momentum spun him sideways into his companion. The second man, caught by surprise, stumbled, and in that split second of chaos she drove a knee into his ribs so hard he collapsed with a wheezing cry. The first, tangled with his ally, took her palm strike across his jaw before he could reset, his head snapping sideways violently, his legs folding beneath him like a puppet with its strings cut. The last one standing hesitated. His eyes darted between his fallen comrades and her steady figure, and for the first time his bravado faltered. She studied him, not with arrogance, but with the cold, methodical focus of someone who had measured every strike, every counter, and found efficiency in the violence. He hesitated too long. She didn't wait for him to summon courage. In 2 quick steps, she closed the distance, her hand snapping out to seize his collar, dragging him off balance as her foot hooked behind his ankle. He toppled, his back slamming into the floor with a thud that echoed in the cavernous hangar. Before he could scramble back up, her fist hovered just above his throat, her eyes locked onto his. He froze, realizing the fight was over before he could even begin. Silence stretched across the hangar, broken only by the groans of the defeated men and the steady tick of the timer still running on the wall. She stood, rolling her shoulders back, refusing to let her own exhaustion show. Sweat streaked down her temple, but her breathing remained controlled, her eyes clear. The instructor's voice finally cut through, calling out the time. 83 seconds. That was all it had taken. Murmurs spread among the onlookers, fellow trainees, officers, and a few hardened veterans brought in to assess the drill. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others whispered with newfound respect. The 5 men who had thought themselves unbeatable now struggled to rise, one clutching broken ribs, another holding a shattered nose, all of them humbled in ways that would leave more than bruises. But for her, it wasn't pride that burned in her chest. It was necessity. Every movement she had made came from years of discipline, endless repetition of drills where hesitation meant failure, where hesitation in real combat meant death. She hadn't been trying to humiliate them. She had been proving something to herself, to the officers watching, and maybe even to the ghosts that followed her from missions past. Being stripped of her weapon hadn't left her powerless. It had forced her to remember what she was without the crutch of steel and gunpowder. And what she was, what she had become, was something that didn't rely on chance or numbers. She had become her own weapon, honed sharper than any blade they could ever hand her. When the instructor dismissed the drill, she didn't celebrate. She simply collected herself, straightened her uniform, and walked toward the exit as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet every eye in the hangar followed her, some with awe, others with fear, all with the unshakable understanding that they had just witnessed something rare. Strength wasn't always about bulk or firepower. Sometimes it was about precision, clarity, and the refusal to bend even when the odds stacked against you. 83 seconds had been enough to remind everyone there that true power wasn't in the weapon you carried, it was in the resolve that carried you. The silence that followed her exit from the hangar was almost louder than the fight itself. She felt the weight of their eyes pressing into her back, but she didn't turn, didn't let them see that her pulse was still thrumming like a drum beneath her skin. Outside, the air was sharp with dust and fuel, the kind of dry heat that clung to your throat and lungs. She drew it in slowly, centering herself, willing her heartbeat to fall into rhythm again. She knew what they would say, how rumors would spread across the base by nightfall. 5 men, disarmed, dropped in less than a minute and a half. Some would treat it like a legend, others would dismiss it as luck, but the truth lived only in her muscles, in the bruises forming on her arms where strikes had landed, in the ache of her joints from the precise violence she had unleashed. She kept moving, unwilling to let the moment trap her in pride. Or doubt. Pride made you careless. Doubt made you weak. She had no room for either. Her path took her to the barracks, where the echo of boots on concrete followed her every step. She pushed open the door, the smell of metal bunks, sweat, and detergent filling her senses. A few of her fellow soldiers were gathered inside, their conversations falling silent as she entered. She saw the flicker in their eyes, half respect, half wariness. They had heard. Word traveled faster than any official report. She ignored their stares, sitting heavily on her bunk and unlacing her boots with mechanical precision. Her hands trembled only slightly, the aftershock of adrenaline finding its way out. She clenched her fists once, hard, before forcing them to relax. Control was everything. Lose control and you were no different from the chaos you claimed to fight against. The door swung open again, and Sergeant Kravitz stepped inside. He was a man built like a wall, his uniform stretched tight over muscles earned in decades of service, his voice always carrying a gravelly authority. He scanned the room, his gaze locking onto her immediately. "Outside," he said simply, and she rose without hesitation. The hallway was empty, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as he led her away from the others. When they reached a quieter corner, he stopped, crossing his arms. His eyes studied her, not with suspicion, but with the measuring weight of someone who had seen enough soldiers break to know who might bend next. "That was clean work," he said finally. "Too clean for a drill." She met his gaze, her expression calm. "I trained for it," she answered. He shook his head. "No. You lived for it. There's a difference." His words hung in the air, and though she didn't reply, she felt them press into her chest like a stone. He wasn't wrong. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "The brass is talking. They want to move you off the grid for a while. Special assignment. Not everyone's pleased you embarrassed 5 of their best in front of half the base." She almost laughed, but the sound never left her throat. Instead, she simply asked, "When?" His mouth curved into something between a smile and a grimace. "Soon. Maybe tonight. Pack light." Then he walked away, leaving her with more questions than answers. Special assignment. Off the grid. The words tasted like iron. She had seen what those assignments did to people. You came back different, if you came back at all. She returned to her bunk, her mind already shifting gears. She didn't ask why she had been chosen. She didn't need to. The demonstration in the hangar had been both a test and a signal. Someone higher up had been watching, waiting for proof, and now they had it. She began to pack with quiet efficiency, sliding essentials into her duffel, extra fatigues, field knife, canteen, the small photo she kept tucked inside her journal. A girl in civilian clothes, her hair braided, smiling in a way she hadn't smiled in years. Her sister. She tucked the photo away quickly, as if the memory itself could weaken her resolve if left exposed too long. A soldier lived on discipline, not sentiment. Still, it went with her. Always. Night fell fast, the desert heat bleeding into a chill that crept under doors and through thin walls. When the knock came at her bunk, she was already awake, boots laced, bag ready. 2 MPs stood waiting, their faces impassive, their rifles slung across their chests. "Orders," one said, handing her a sealed envelope. She didn't open it until they had escorted her to the transport truck idling outside. The engine growled low, the headlights cutting through dust as she climbed into the back. The envelope tore open in her hands, the paper inside holding a single directive. No location, no explanation, only, report to Airstrip 12. 0200 hours. Classified mission status. It was typical, vague enough to be meaningless, yet heavy with implications. She folded the paper and tucked it into her pocket, leaning back against the cold metal of the truck side as it rumbled forward. The airstrip loomed like a shadowed skeleton against the night sky, floodlights glaring down on a waiting transport plane. The hum of its engines carried across the tarmac, steady and unforgiving. She stepped down from the truck, her boots striking the concrete with a resolve she didn't entirely feel. A small group stood near the plane, figures blurred by the brightness of the lights. As she approached, their outlines sharpened, 4 men, unknown to her, each carrying themselves with the confidence of specialists. They watched her the way predators watch each other, calculating, cautious. A man in a black uniform stepped forward, no insignia, no nameplate. "You're late," he said flatly, though she was not. She didn't respond. He studied her a moment longer before nodding. "Bored?" She did as ordered, climbing the ramp into the hollow belly of the plane, the others following in silence. The interior smelled of oil and leather, the kind of smell that never left no matter how many times it was scrubbed. She strapped herself into a seat, her eyes scanning the faces around her. None of them spoke. None of them needed to. Whatever this was, it wasn't ordinary. The engines roared to life, the plane trembling as it prepared to lift. She closed her eyes briefly, not in prayer, but in calculation. Somewhere ahead lay the reason they had stripped her of her weapon, forced her into proving herself with nothing but her hands, and then pulled her into the shadows of classified orders. She didn't know where the plane was headed, or what would wait when the wheels touched down, but she knew one thing with certainty. Whatever they expected of her, whatever they demanded, she would deliver. Because when the weapon was taken away, she had already learned the truth. She was the weapon. The plane lifted into the night with a shudder that pressed her deeper into the seat, the engine screaming against the pull of gravity until the force steadied and the hum leveled into something constant, almost like a heartbeat. She didn't ask where they were going. No one did. The 4 men sitting across from her had the look of ghosts, their eyes steady, their movements precise, stripped of the small habits that betrayed nerves. These were not recruits or ordinary soldiers. They were killers, sharpened by missions that never made it into reports, the kind of missions whispered about only when the alcohol was strong enough to loosen tongues. She didn't fear them, but she knew better than to underestimate men who had walked out of shadows she hadn't yet entered. They glanced at her, weighing her presence, perhaps wondering why a woman who had been stripped of her weapon for a drill was now sitting among them. None spoke, and neither did she. Silence became the language, and in that silence she measured each one, the scar along the jaw of the man to her left, the missing fingertip on another's hand, the faint burn marks crawling up the neck of the third, the way the last tapped his boot once, rhythmically, then stopped, forcing himself into stillness. These were fragments of stories she might never hear, but she understood them all the same. Pain had written itself across their bodies, and they had survived it. Hours passed, the dark outside unbroken by anything but the occasional turbulence. She dozed without sleeping, her mind replaying the drill in the hangar, the sound of bones giving way beneath her strikes, the instructor's voice calling out the time. 83 seconds. She wondered if that had been the deciding moment, the reason she was here instead of on some routine patrol or guard duty. She wondered if those watching had decided then that she was either expendable enough to send into the kind of mission others wouldn't come back from, or valuable enough to risk everything for. Both possibilities were dangerous. When the plane finally began its descent, her eyes opened, steady and clear, even as her stomach tightened with the change in altitude. The men across from her did the same, their gazes sharp now, their hands tightening straps, checking gear. A voice crackled through the intercom, distorted but commanding. Final approach. 2 minutes. She leaned forward, fastening the last buckle of her harness, her duffel secured at her feet. When the ramp lowered, the smell of wet earth and jungle heat poured in, thick and suffocating, a sharp contrast to the dry air she had left behind. The landing zone was rough, barely a strip carved into dense forest, flares marking the edges as the plane screeched against the dirt. They disembarked quickly, boots sinking into mud, weapons slung and ready. Except hers. She carried only her knife and the strength in her hands. The man in black from the airstrip reappeared, stepping from the cockpit with the same blank expression. He gave no briefing, only pointed toward the tree line. "You move now." The team didn't hesitate, and neither did she. They slipped into the jungle, the roar of the departing plane swallowed quickly by the oppressive hum of insects and the distant calls of animals that never slept. The canopy above blotted out most of the moonlight, leaving only shadows to guide them. Sweat gathered instantly on her skin, the air heavy with moisture, each breath thick. She moved in silence, matching the pace of the others, her senses sharpening with every step. Out here, hesitation was death. Out here, the mission was the only thing that mattered. They walked for an hour before the leader, the scarred man she had marked earlier, raised a fist to halt. The team froze as one, their discipline absolute. He crouched low, brushing his fingers against the dirt. A faint trail, nearly invisible, cut across their path, disturbed leaves and compressed soil revealing that others had passed through not long ago. He glanced back at them, his eyes narrowing. "They know we're here," he murmured. His voice was low but certain, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had tracked enemies for years and rarely been wrong. She felt the shift in the air then, the kind of tension that told her they were no longer moving toward danger, it was already around them. The jungle seemed to breathe differently, the chirp of insects faltering, the silence stretching too long between sounds. She tightened her grip on the knife strapped to her thigh, every sense alive. Then it came. A flicker of movement in the branches above, the snap of a twig too deliberate, and before the warning could leave her lips, gunfire erupted from the trees. The first volley was wild, designed to scatter them, to force chaos into their ranks. But these men didn't scatter. They dropped low, spreading into formation with instinct born from countless ambushes. Muzzle flashes lit the foliage, the sharp stench of gunpowder mixing with the wet earth. She moved with them, rolling behind the cover of a thick tree trunk as bullets chewed bark inches from her head. One of the team returned fire, his rifle barking in short, controlled bursts. A cry rang out in the distance, proof that at least one of the attackers had fallen. But there were more. Dozens, maybe. Shadows slipped between trees, disciplined enough to fire and move, the jungle becoming a blur of motion and noise. She stayed low, knife in hand, waiting. She knew better than to waste shots she didn't have. Her weapon was patience, her weapon was the moment when the enemy closed in too close, believing distance was still on their side. And they did. One came too fast, bursting through the undergrowth with his rifle raised, expecting panic. She rose like a strike of lightning, her hand clamping on the barrel, shoving it aside as her elbow drove into his throat. He gurgled, staggered, and she yanked the knife across his arm, severing his grip. His weapon clattered uselessly to the ground. Before he could scream, her knee crushed his face into the dirt. Silent. Efficient. One down. The fight raged on, but now the team had adapted, their return fire sharper, pushing the ambushes back step by step. The scarred leader barked orders in clipped bursts, repositioning them, forcing the attackers into choke points where the jungle offered no escape. She stayed close, but never idle, slipping from tree to tree like a shadow herself, striking when one broke through the line, vanishing again before others could target her. By the time the gunfire thinned, the ground was littered with bodies, the stench of blood mixing with the damp air, and the survivors of the ambush melted back into the night. The leader signaled ceasefire, his eyes scanning the trees for movement. None came. Slowly, silence reclaimed the jungle, broken only by the ragged breaths of the living. They regrouped, counting heads. All 5 of them were standing. One man was bleeding from a graze on his arm, another limped slightly from shrapnel lodged in his leg, but they were alive. She wiped the blood from her knife, her expression unreadable. The leader looked at her for the first time without calculation, only acknowledgement. "You don't flinch," he said, his voice low. She didn't answer, only returned his gaze until he nodded once and turned back to the path ahead. They moved again, deeper into the jungle, their mission not even begun, yet already painted with the reminder that nothing about this would be clean. She followed without hesitation, her mind steady, her body ready, because she understood now more than ever, if they stripped away her weapon again, if they left her with nothing but mud, sweat, and blood, it would still be enough. She was still enough. The jungle swallowed their footsteps, the mud clutching at their boots as if trying to drag them down into the earth, and the air felt heavier after the ambush, like the forest itself had decided to watch them more closely. She stayed at the rear of the formation, her eyes sweeping the shadows, ears straining past the drone of insects and the occasional distant howl of something wild. Every sense was sharp, alert for the smallest shift that might betray danger. The scarred man led with an unbroken stride, pausing only to check the trail, his hand gestures crisp and certain. The team moved as one, efficient and silent, even with the dull ache of wounds among them. She admired their resilience, but she didn't mirror it in outward gestures. Her face remained calm, her movement steady, betraying nothing. Inside, however, she catalogued every detail, every tree and bend, every silence that stretched too long. Ambushes didn't happen without reason, not in a jungle this unforgiving. Someone knew they were coming, and someone wanted them buried here before they reached their destination. Hours bled together, the night thickening into something almost solid, broken only when a faint glow shimmered ahead through the foliage. The scarred leader raised his hand, and they crouched low, moving closer until the source revealed itself. A camp. Not large, but organized, with tents pitched in careful lines, lanterns hanging from poles, the faint crackle of a radio drifting across the clearing. Armed men moved about casually, confident, their rifles slung loose, their laughter too loud for soldiers on guard. She counted quickly, eyes flicking from shadow to shadow. 20 at least, maybe more, and that was only what was visible. She could see crates stacked near the center of the camp, metal containers marked with stenciled codes, guarded more closely than the men around them. Supplies, weapons, maybe something worse. The scarred leader motioned for them to pull back into the brush, their bodies pressed against the wet earth as they retreated just far enough to avoid the glow. Once they were out of sight, he leaned in close, his voice a whisper. That's our target. Intel says those crates are carrying components for something bigger, something not meant to be here. We take them out, we cripple half their operation. His eyes flicked to her then, lingering for only a second before returning to the others. No mistakes. We move in 2 teams. Silent first. If it goes loud, we finish it quick. They nodded, already checking their gear, sliding fresh magazines into rifles, tightening straps. She had no rifle to ready, only the knife she kept within reach, and her hands, scarred and calloused from years of discipline. The scarred leader divided them, taking 2 men with him to flank from the left. She was sent with the other 2 to circle right, closer to the crates. They moved like shadows, each step careful, each breath measured, until the glow of the lanterns touched their faces with faint light. She slid forward through the underbrush, her knife glinting once before she covered it with her hand. The first guard on her side of the camp stood with his back half-turned, his focus drifting. She rose behind him like a phantom, her arm wrapping around his neck, her blade pressing deep enough to silence him before he could even gasp. His body sagged, and she eased him to the ground without a sound. The 2 men with her glanced back, their eyes holding a flicker of surprise, maybe even respect, but they didn't linger. They pressed forward, closer to the stacks of crates. The camp had a rhythm, men moving in lazy patrols, their trust in isolation making them blind. That trust broke the moment a muffled cry rose from the left flank, quickly drowned in the crack of suppressed gunfire. She knew what it meant, the scarred leader had struck. The camp reacted instantly, shouts breaking the night, rifles swinging, confusion spreading. Her 2 companions opened fire, their suppressed rounds cutting down 3 men before the alarm carried. She didn't fire, but she didn't hesitate either. She darted into the open, knife flashing, striking at a man who stumbled into her path with wide eyes and half-raised weapon. He fell before he could squeeze the trigger, his blood dark on the mud. The camp erupted fully now, muzzle flashes painting the clearing in bursts of orange light, the air thick with gunpowder and screams. She kept low, weaving between shadows, striking where the chaos was thickest, her movements fluid, precise, efficient. Every time a rifle turned her way, she was already gone, a whisper of motion that ended with another man down. The crates became the focal point, shouts rising as enemy soldiers clustered near them, trying to protect whatever cargo was inside. She could see desperation in their movements, the way they formed a shield around the metal containers. Whatever was in there mattered, and that made it the only thing that mattered to her now. She pushed forward, her breath burning in her chest, sweat streaking down her face, the heat of the jungle mixing with the heat of battle until it felt like fire beneath her skin. The 2 men with her laid down cover fire, pushing the defenders back step by step. She reached the first crate, her hand slamming against the metal, the cold shock of it jolting through her. It was sealed tight, heavy, impossible to move quickly. Which meant the only way to neutralize it was destruction. She signaled to the others, drawing a line across her throat, then pointing to the crates. One of them nodded, pulling a charge from his pack, slapping it against the steel with practiced speed. The other covered them, his rifle spitting in controlled bursts. She stood guard, knife ready, scanning the shadows for anyone daring enough to rush them. The scarred leader appeared from the other side, blood streaked across his sleeve, his rifle smoking. "We set," he barked. The man with the charge gave a sharp nod. 30 seconds. That was all the warning they had. She grabbed the nearest weapon from the ground, a fallen enemy's rifle, and fired into the trees to force distance. Bullets snapped back, one grazing her shoulder, hot pain searing through her flesh, but she didn't flinch. She only shifted her stance, using the rifle until the clip ran dry, then tossing it aside and drawing her knife again. The seconds stretched, every one of them feeling like a lifetime, until the charge finally detonated with a roar that shook the ground. Fire burst upward, the crates shredded, fragments flying, the blast ripping through men too slow to run. The camp dissolved into chaos, survivors fleeing into the jungle, their shouts fading with their retreat. Smoke curled into the sky, thick and acrid, the flames devouring what remained of the cargo. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of fire and the ragged breaths of the team. They regrouped at the edge of the clearing, their faces streaked with sweat, mud, and blood. The scarred leader surveyed the destruction, his eyes hard but satisfied. "Objective complete," he said, though his tone carried no triumph. This was just one battle in a war that would never end. He looked at her then, really looked, his gaze heavy with unspoken questions. She held his stare, her shoulder bleeding, her hand still steady. "You fight like you've already buried yourself," he said quietly, not as insult but as recognition. She didn't answer, only pulled a strip of cloth from her pack and bound the wound with practiced ease. There was no room for weakness. Not here. Not ever. The jungle pressed in around them again as they moved out, leaving the burning camp behind. The flames would draw attention, and attention in this place was always deadly. She knew this was only the beginning, that whatever they had destroyed was just one piece of something larger, something waiting in the darkness ahead. Her body ached, her blood still dripping warm against her skin, but her mind was sharp, her resolve unbroken. The mission wasn't done. The jungle hadn't finished testing them. And she hadn't finished proving, not to them, not to herself, not to the unseen hands pulling strings from above, that stripping her of a weapon had never left her defenseless. She moved with the team, swallowed once more by the shadows, the fire behind them a fading reminder of how quickly everything could burn. The fire from the camp still glowed faintly behind them, a reminder of destruction that could not be undone, but the team didn't look back. They pushed deeper into the jungle, their boots sinking into soft earth, their bodies moving like shadows beneath the thick canopy. The air reeked of smoke and blood, mingling with the damp rot of vegetation, every breath heavy in their lungs. She stayed in step, her shoulder still bleeding beneath the bandage she had wrapped, but her face betrayed nothing. Pain was irrelevant. Pain was a language she had long ago learned to silence. The scarred leader set the pace, his stride unbroken despite the gash across his arm. He didn't slow, didn't falter, because slowing meant death, and faltering meant the jungle would swallow them whole. The others followed with the same quiet determination, their expressions grim, eyes cutting through the darkness for any hint of movement. They knew the blast had been loud enough to be heard for miles. Reinforcements would come. The only question was when, and from which direction. They marched for hours, the night dragging into dawn, the light struggling to break through the canopy in muted gray shafts. The insects never stopped, their buzzing and chirping relentless, but even that constant hum couldn't mask the sense of being watched. She felt it in the back of her neck, in the prickling across her skin, the instinct born from years of survival. She tightened her grip on the knife, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. When they stopped briefly to drink, she crouched with her back against a thick root, her eyes still roaming. The scarred leader caught her gaze, reading the same unease in her expression that haunted his own. He didn't say it out loud, but the look was enough. They weren't alone. The jungle held eyes they couldn't see, and those eyes were waiting. The mission had shifted now. Destroying the crates had been only the opening move, a strike designed to cripple logistics, but the real purpose was still ahead, buried deeper within the forest. They all knew it, even if no one spoke it. Operations like this didn't end with a single explosion. There was always another target, something more valuable, something hidden. Their silence grew heavier with every step, the exhaustion in their bodies weighed down not just by distance but by anticipation. She didn't ask for details. She didn't need them. Whatever lay ahead would reveal itself soon enough, and when it did, it would demand everything they had left. By midday the humidity pressed against them like a shroud, sweat soaking through uniforms, every breath dragging. They stopped briefly to eat, nothing more than ration bars and sips of lukewarm water, consumed quickly before they were on their feet again. It was during this pause that the scarred leader finally broke the silence. "Intel says there's a compound," he said, his voice low, words measured. "Hidden. Buried in the jungle. What we hit last night was just supply. What we hit next is command." His eyes swept over them, steady and unflinching. "We find it. We take it out. And if we can't, we bring back proof it exists. That's the mission." He didn't elaborate further, and no one asked. They all understood the weight of it. A hidden compound meant more than tents and crates. It meant planning, coordination, maybe even something powerful enough to shift entire conflicts. As dusk bled into the horizon, they reached higher ground, a ridge that overlooked a valley below. From here the jungle seemed endless, a sea of green stretching as far as the eye could see, the mist curling like smoke between the trees. But hidden within that vastness, if one looked closely enough, there was order where there should have been chaos. The faint outline of paths cut through the vegetation, unnatural clearings too square to be accidents, a glimmer of metal roofs half concealed by camouflage netting. The compound. It was larger than any of them expected, a small fortress swallowed by the jungle, guarded by more men than they had bullets for. She crouched beside the scarred leader, studying it with unblinking eyes. The layout told a story: perimeter guards posted at key points, a central building heavier with structure than the rest, vehicles parked near what might have been a hangar or storage depot. This was no temporary camp. This was permanent. This was rooted. They retreated from the ridge, careful not to linger in the open, and regrouped in the shadows below. Plans were whispered in clipped voices, strategies debated with quick gestures and sharper looks. In the end, there were only two choices: infiltration or annihilation. Neither promised survival. The scarred leader turned to them, his expression carved from stone. "We don't have the firepower to level it. We go in quiet. We find proof. And if we can, we end it from the inside." His gaze flicked to her again, just for a second, but long enough for her to know why. Her presence hadn't been an accident. Her test in the hangar, the ambush in the trees, the camp raid, all of it had been building to this. They wanted her where weapons couldn't speak. They wanted her where bare hands and silence were sharper than any rifle. The night cloaked them as they moved, slipping like shadows down into the valley, every step careful, every breath a risk. They reached the outer perimeter just past midnight, the guards pacing lazily, their flashlights sweeping in arcs that left blind spots wide enough for ghosts to pass through. She was the first to move. She darted low, pressing against the earth, her body merging with shadow until she rose behind one of the guards, her arms snapping around his neck, her blade slicing clean, her hand covering his mouth until his last breath shut it out. She eased him down, her expression unchanged, her focus absolute. The others moved in after her, repeating the same quiet violence, until the perimeter was broken and the way in lay open. They slipped deeper, the compound unfolding around them in layers of steel and wood, lights burning dim behind camouflage. Men laughed inside one of the outer barracks, their voices muffled, unaware of the death slipping past their doors. She moved with the same efficiency as before, every strike fast, every motion precise, leaving no sound behind. By the time they reached the central structure, they had left a trail of silence behind them, bodies hidden in the dark, lives extinguished like candles snuffed by the wind. The central building loomed larger, its walls reinforced, guarded by two men who stood with rifles at the ready. These men weren't lazy. Their eyes scanned, their stances sharp, their discipline evident. She studied them for a moment, her mind running through calculations, angles, speed, probability. Then she moved. She darted forward, low and fast, closing the distance before either could raise alarm. Her hand seized the first by the wrist, twisting his rifle aside as her knife drove into his chest. She spun with the momentum, her elbows smashing into the jaw of the second, his rifle slipping from his grip as he stumbled. She was on him instantly, her weight driving him to the ground, her blade finding its mark before his shout could leave his throat. She rose again, her breath steady, her hands dripping red, the doorway now unguarded. The scarred leader signaled the team, and they slipped inside. What they found stopped even hardened men in their tracks. Rows of equipment lined the walls: computers, communications arrays, crates marked with foreign symbols, maps spread across tables with routes drawn in thick lines of ink. It wasn't just a command post. It was a nerve center, a hub for operations far larger than this jungle. She scanned the maps, her eyes locking onto cities, borders, arrows pointing toward targets hundreds of miles away. This was no hidden camp meant to survive. This was meant to expand, to spread. The weight of it settled on her chest like stone. Proof wasn't just here. It was everywhere, screaming from the walls, waiting to be taken. But as she reached for the maps, the faint click of a trigger behind her froze her in place. The sound of the trigger clicking behind her was sharp enough to cut through the tension in the room, and her body froze for a fraction of a second, her instincts calculating faster than thought. She didn't turn her head immediately, didn't flinch, because sudden movement would only end in blood against the wall. The scarred leader glanced from the corner of his eye, his hand tightening around his weapon, but he didn't raise it. The rest of the team stiffened, their silence an unspoken acknowledgement of how bad this had just become. Slowly, she shifted her eyes without moving her head, catching a glimpse of the figure behind her. The man was different from the others, his uniform sharper, his stance firm, his expression composed instead of careless. His finger rested on the trigger of his rifle, not trembling, not hesitant. His eyes locked on hers, cold and unblinking. This wasn't a guard. This was command. "Drop it," he said, his voice low, accented, carrying authority that vibrated through the room like a current. For a moment no one moved. Her knife glistened in her hand, blood still dripping from its edge, but she didn't let it fall. His rifle shifted slightly, the barrel pressing tighter against the space between her shoulder blades. "Now." She opened her hand slowly, letting the blade slide from her fingers until it clattered softly on the floor. The scarred leader's jaw clenched, his body tensing as if ready to strike, but her eyes flicked toward him with the smallest movement, a signal he recognized instantly. Not yet. Timing was survival. The man stepped closer, the rifle never leaving her back, and with his free hand he gestured for the others to move away from the tables. "You think you are clever," he said, his gaze sweeping over them all. "But you walked into my home, into the heart of what you seek to destroy, and now you will not walk out." He nodded toward the door, and within seconds more soldiers appeared, flooding the room with rifles raised, their boots heavy against the wood floor. The team found themselves surrounded, outnumbered, every exit sealed with barrels pointed at their chests. The scarred leader's eyes scanned the room once, measuring the odds, but even he couldn't deny them. Fighting now would be suicide, and suicide wasn't mission success. They were disarmed swiftly, their weapons stripped away, their knives kicked aside, until only their bodies remained as tools of survival. Her eyes stayed calm even as hands shoved her forward, forcing her against the wall beside the others. The commander's gaze lingered on her longer than the rest, his lips curling in something between a sneer and admiration. "You are the one they whisper about," he said softly, almost to himself. "The one who kills with nothing but her hands. I have heard the stories. I did not believe them. Perhaps tonight I will see if they are true." His words cut deeper than the rifle at her back, not because of fear, but because she understood what he was saying. This wasn't just an arrest. This was a game. And in his game, survival depended on performance. They were dragged from the central building, pushed into the open yard of the compound where the glow of floodlights burned down from tall poles. The night insects had quieted here, as if even nature feared to speak in this place. Soldiers lined the perimeter, their faces hard, their rifles steady, watching as prisoners were shoved to the ground. The team knelt in a row, dirt grinding into their knees, their hands bound behind them. She was forced beside the scarred leader, who kept his head bowed, his breathing steady, though she could see the fire in his eyes. One of the soldiers pressed a boot into her back, trying to force her lower, but she resisted just enough to remain upright, her gaze fixed on the commander who stepped into the light. He addressed them like a lecturer before an audience, his voice carrying across the compound. "You come into my land, destroy what you do not understand, thinking you are righteous. But here, your weapons are nothing. Your numbers are nothing. Here, only strength speaks." He paced slowly in front of them, each step deliberate, his rifle hanging casually at his side. Then his eyes flicked toward her again, sharp and pointed. "You," he said, stopping in front of her. "Stand." A soldier yanked her upward, shoving her into the circle of light. She didn't resist, her movements controlled, her head lifting as she straightened her spine. She stood there, hands bound, the sweat and blood on her body glistening under the floodlights, her eyes fixed on him without fear. The commander gestured, and 5 men stepped forward from the ring of soldiers. They were bigger than most, their muscles straining against uniforms, their expressions twisted into cruel smirks. Each carried the confidence of someone used to violence, men who had broken others before. They spread out in a half-circle around her, their boots scraping against the dirt, their knuckles cracking as if warming up for sport. The commander's smile was cold. "Let us see if the legend is true. You have no blade, no gun. Only your hands. If you can defeat them, you live. If not, you die." The bindings on her wrists were cut loose, the rope falling to the ground. For a moment she rolled her shoulders, flexed her fingers, feeling blood return to her veins. The soldiers around her jeered, some shouting crude encouragements to the 5 men, others laughing at the impossibility of her survival. But she didn't hear them. She closed her eyes briefly, drawing a breath, centering herself. 83 seconds. That was all it had taken before. Could it be done again? Could it be done now, after the exhaustion of the march, the raids, the wounds? Her muscles ached, her ribs burned, but her mind sharpened like a blade. She opened her eyes, her stare fixed on the first man who lunged toward her. He swung heavy, his fist aimed for her jaw, but she slipped aside, catching his arm and twisting, using his own momentum to drag him forward as her knee drove into his stomach. The air left his lungs in a sharp grunt, and before he could recover, her elbow smashed into the side of his skull, sending him crumpling to the dirt. The crowd shouted, half in surprise, half in anger, but she was already moving, pivoting toward the second who charged in with a roar. She ducked beneath his swing, her palm striking upward into his throat with brutal precision. He staggered, clutching at his windpipe, gasping for air that would never come, and she finished him with a sharp kick that snapped his knee sideways, dropping him screaming to the ground. The third came at her from behind, arms wrapping around her waist in an attempt to lift and slam her, but she shifted her weight instantly, hooking her leg behind his and twisting her hips. His balance faltered, and she drove the back of her head into his nose with a crack that sprayed blood across her neck. His grip loosened, and she spun, grabbing his collar and dragging him downward into her rising knee, the force collapsing him into silence. Sweat dripped down her brow, but her movements never slowed, her focus never wavered. The fourth hesitated, seeing the speed and brutality of what she had done, but hesitation was fatal. She closed the distance. Herself, her fist striking across his jaw with bone-cracking force, her other hand seizing his arm and snapping it backward with a sickening pop. He screamed, staggering back, but she drove forward, a kick slamming into his chest that sent him sprawling to the dirt, writhing. Only one remained, his eyes wide now, his confidence shattered, but fear made him reckless. He grabbed a fallen stick from the ground, swinging it wildly at her head. She stepped inside the arc of his swing, her hand seizing the stick, twisting it from his grasp before driving its end hard into his temple. His body stiffened, then collapsed lifelessly at her feet. Silence fell for a moment, heavy and suffocating, as 5 men lay broken in the dirt around her, their groans and gasps the only sound beneath the floodlights. 83 seconds had passed. She stood there, chest rising and falling steadily, blood dripping from her hands but her eyes calm, steady, unshaken. The soldiers who had laughed before were silent now, their jeers turned to stunned disbelief. The commander's smile faded into something else, not anger, not fear, but respect edged with something dangerous. He stepped closer, studying her as if trying to understand what manner of creature could do what she had just done. She met his gaze, unflinching, her silence louder than any words. The floodlights hummed above, casting stark white shadows across the compound, and the silence that followed her victory was more suffocating than the cheers had been. The 5 men lay in twisted shapes on the dirt, some unconscious, some choking on their own blood, all broken. She stood motionless in the circle, chest rising with slow breaths, eyes locked on the commander. The crowd of soldiers didn't know how to react, some stared in awe, others in fear, others with unease at what they had just witnessed. These were men who lived in violence, who had seen executions, massacres, cruelty beyond imagination. Yet in less than 2 minutes, a woman with nothing but her bare hands had dismantled 5 of their strongest, and she had done it with a calmness that unsettled even the most hardened among them. The commander took a step forward, his boots crunching on the dirt, his expression unreadable in the glare of the lights. He studied her in silence, as if trying to see through her skin into whatever force had carried her through that storm of fists and blood. His lips parted at last, his voice low, calm, carrying a weight that silenced the murmurs around them. "Remarkable," he said, his tone closer to fascination than anger. "They told me stories, but stories are lies. What I saw just now is truth. You are not like the others. You are a weapon that no man forged, a weapon of flesh and will. And I want to know, what breaks you?" His words hung heavy, the implication sharper than the rifle slung across his chest. The scarred leader shifted on his knees, his hands still bound, his jaw tightening as he stared at the commander. "You'll find nothing to break there," he growled. "You think you've captured her. You think you've won. But you don't understand what's standing in front of you." The commander turned his gaze toward him, almost amused. "Perhaps," he said softly. "Perhaps I do not understand. But I will." He raised a hand, and 2 soldiers stepped forward, grabbing her arms, attempting to drag her back toward the line of prisoners. She resisted only slightly, enough to make them struggle, before she allowed herself to be pushed down beside the scarred leader once more. Her eyes remained on the commander, calm and steady, the way a predator might watch another predator across the grass. The men who had cheered for her defeat now whispered uneasily among themselves, and some even avoided her gaze, unwilling to meet the eyes of someone who had just rewritten their understanding of human limits. The commander, however, showed no such hesitation. He walked slowly back and forth before them, his rifle hanging loosely, his mind clearly grinding with new ideas. "You came for proof," he said suddenly, his voice carrying across the compound. "That much is obvious. You wanted evidence of what we build here, of what we prepare for. And now you have it. But you will never leave with it. Not unless I allow it. And why should I?" He paused, his eyes sweeping over them, before settling back on her. "Unless, of course, you prove useful in another way." Her silence was her answer, but silence could be as sharp as defiance. The commander smirked faintly, not because he had won, but because he believed he still could. He gave an order in his language, sharp and quick, and the soldiers moved instantly. The team was hauled to their feet, dragged across the compound and into a concrete building near the center. Inside, the air was cooler but stale, the walls damp with condensation, the ceiling low. They were shoved into a room that smelled of rust and mildew, the iron bars of the door slamming shut behind them with finality. Darkness pressed in, broken only by a single flickering bulb overhead. For a while no one spoke. Their breathing filled the silence, heavy and ragged from exhaustion, pain, and the weight of what had just unfolded. She sat against the wall, her hands bound once more, her eyes closed as if resting, though every muscle in her body remained coiled. The scarred leader leaned against the opposite wall, his voice low when he finally spoke. "They're not going to keep us alive for long. He's curious about you, but that won't last. Once he thinks he has his answer, we're done." One of the younger men spat blood into the dirt floor, shaking his head. "We should have gone for it back there. Should have fought. Better to die fast than rot in here waiting." She opened her eyes slowly, her voice calm but cutting. "Dying fast is easy. Surviving is harder. We didn't come here to die. We came here to finish what we started." The scarred leader met her gaze across the room, and for the first time that night, there was something like a flicker of hope in his eyes. He had always been the one to steady others, the one to lead, but now he understood why she had been brought into this mission. She wasn't just muscle. She was resolve, sharpened into something unbreakable. Hours bled away, though time was difficult to measure in the stale half-darkness. Guards came and went, bringing no food, no water, only silence. Their rifles were steady, their expressions colder than stone, never speaking, never meeting the prisoner's eyes. The air grew heavier, and the stench of blood on her clothes thickened until it felt like a second skin. Still, she sat unmoving, her breathing steady, her eyes watching every detail, the lock on the door, the rhythm of footsteps outside, the faint cracks in the walls that suggested more than one way out. It was nearly dawn when the commander returned. His boots echoed against the concrete floor, his presence filling the space before he even stepped into view. The guards opened the bars, and he walked inside without fear, his gaze falling instantly on her. "You fascinate me," he said quietly, almost conversationally, as if they were old acquaintances. "Strength without weapon, discipline without command. You could be an ally. You could be more valuable than an enemy. But loyalty is what I do not yet see in you. That is what I will test." He gestured to the guards, and they hauled her roughly to her feet, dragging her out into the blinding light of the morning. The others shouted after her, straining against their bindings, but she didn't resist. She let herself be taken, her head high, her silence louder than any promise. Outside, the compound had stirred to life. Men moved in lines, equipment was shifted, trucks rumbled with supplies, and the hidden fortress beat with the rhythm of a living organism. She was dragged to a raised platform at the center, where the commander stood waiting. The crowd of soldiers gathered again, their eyes sharp with curiosity and unease. The commander raised his voice, addressing them as much as he addressed her. "This woman is strong. Stronger than any I have seen. But strength without loyalty is dangerous. Today, we will see what she is." He snapped his fingers, and two prisoners were dragged from another building, locals, their faces gaunt with hunger, their wrists bound, their bodies weak. They were thrown onto the dirt before her, whimpering softly. The commander placed a knife in her hand. "Kill them," he said simply. "Show me that your strength belongs to us. Show me that you obey." The knife felt heavy in her palm, heavier than any blade she had held before, not because of its weight, but because of what it demanded. She looked at the prisoners, their terrified eyes reflecting back the cruelty of the moment, and then at the commander, who stood waiting, confident, certain he had cornered her. Around them, the soldiers leaned in, some smirking, some tense, all eager to see how this legend of flesh and bone would bend. Her fingers tightened around the knife. Her chest rose with a slow, steady breath. And then she moved. The knife glinted in her hand, its blade reflecting the morning sun that burned through the mist. The prisoners on the ground whimpered, their thin shoulders trembling, eyes darting between her and the commander. Around the circle, soldiers leaned forward, their breaths held, the silence heavy with anticipation. The commander stood like a judge, arms crossed, his face carved with a faint smile, certain of the outcome. He believed he had cornered her, that she had no choice but to obey, that strength without loyalty was nothing, and that loyalty could only be proven through obedience. He had no idea what kind of strength he was staring at. Her grip tightened on the hilt, her chest rising once with a slow, steady breath. She knelt beside the first prisoner, her body moving with deliberate calm, and the man flinched as if the blade would fall instantly. She whispered something too soft for anyone else to hear, words that steadied him even as fear shuddered through his body. Then, in one clean movement, she swung, not into his flesh, but into the rope that bound his wrists. The blade sliced through it, the fibers snapping, and gasps erupted from the soldiers. Before the prisoner could even register freedom, she was on her feet, spinning with a precision born from endless discipline. The knife flashed upward, burying itself deep in the throat of the soldier closest to her, blood erupting in a sudden spray. Chaos detonated. For a fraction of a second the world froze, disbelief rooting the soldiers in place. Then the storm broke. Gunfire cracked like thunder, shouts filled the air, and the compound erupted into violence. She tore the rifle from the dying soldier's hands, spinning it around and firing before it even touched her shoulder. Two men dropped instantly, their chests torn open, their weapons clattering against the dirt. The freed prisoner scrambled backward, dragging the other still-bound captive with him, while the scarred leader and the rest of her team surged from the building where they had been held, their captors distracted long enough for them to break free. She moved like a storm through the chaos, every shot precise, every strike purposeful. She ducked behind a crate as bullets ripped splinters into the air, then rolled out, her rifle spitting fire that dropped another pair of soldiers before they could flank her. The knife was still in her other hand, and when a man rushed in too close, she buried it in his gut, twisting, yanking free, and spinning to fire into another charging form. The compound burned with sound now, shouts, screams, the bark of rifles, the clash of boots, and above it all her heartbeat thundered like a drum, steady, unwavering, alive. The scarred leader fought his way to her side, blood streaking his face but his eyes burning with defiance. "We've got to move now," he shouted over the chaos, firing a burst into a cluster of soldiers. She nodded once, already moving toward the central building where the maps and communications had been laid out. "The proof," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the storm. "We don't leave without it." They pushed forward together, the rest of the team covering their flanks, each man and woman fighting like cornered animals. The commander's voice bellowed orders from somewhere above, rage cutting through the din, but his control was crumbling. The compound he had built to be untouchable was being torn apart from the inside by the very people he thought broken. Inside the central building, the chaos was sharper, closer. She kicked a door open, firing into the first soldier who raised a weapon, then dove behind a desk as bullets chewed through the walls. The scarred leader tossed a grenade through the next doorway, the explosion rattling the structure, smoke billowing as screams followed. They swept into the room, clearing it with ruthless efficiency, until the tables and maps lay before them again. She grabbed the documents, shoving them into a satchel, her eyes burning as they scanned the marked cities, the routes, the supplies. This was bigger than any of them had imagined. If these plans reached execution, entire regions would bleed. She didn't pause to think. She stuffed everything she could carry and slung the bag over her shoulder. "Got it? Let's end this." The commander appeared in the doorway as if summoned by her words, his rifle leveled, his face no longer calm but twisted with fury. He fired, and the bullet grazed her arm, hot pain searing through muscle, but she didn't falter. She dropped the empty rifle, her knife flashing into her grip again. The scarred leader fired back, forcing the commander to duck, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he stepped inside, his movements fast, precise, the rifle swinging up again. She moved before he could pull the trigger, closing the distance in a blur. The rifle barked, the shot grazing her side, but her hand clamped on the barrel, wrenching it aside. She drove her forehead into his jaw, bone-crunching, then slammed the knife toward his chest. He twisted, the blade slashing across his shoulder instead of sinking deep, and with a roar he slammed the butt of his rifle into her ribs. Pain exploded, but she didn't let go. She twisted again, wrenching the rifle free, and in the same motion drove the blade straight into his throat. His eyes widened, shock flashing across his face as blood bubbled at his lips. He staggered, his weapon slipping from his grip, his hand clutching at the knife buried in him as if he could will it away. She stepped back, breathing hard, watching as he collapsed to his knees, then fell forward onto the dirt floor, lifeless. The commander of the compound, the man who believed strength meant obedience, was gone. For a moment the fighting outside seemed to falter, the shouts and gunfire slowing as word spread of what had happened. The scarred leader grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the exit. "We've got what we need. Time to go." She nodded, wiping blood from her face, her body screaming with pain but her will unbroken. They burst from the building into the chaos of the yard, their team fighting hard, some wounded, all battered, but alive. She signaled toward the gate, and together they cut a path through the remaining soldiers, their gunfire tearing down resistance until they broke through into the jungle beyond. The jungle swallowed them as it always did, its shadows hiding their retreat, its vastness stretching endlessly around them. Behind, the compound burned, smoke curling into the sky as the remnants of its forces scattered, leaderless and broken. They ran until their lungs burned, until the sound of pursuit faded, until only the whisper of the forest surrounded them again. When at last they stopped, collapsing against roots and rocks, the scarred leader pulled the satchel from her shoulder, opening it to reveal the maps and documents within. He looked at her, his face hard but his eyes softening just slightly. "You did it," he said. "We did it. But without you, none of us would be breathing right now." She didn't answer. She simply leaned back against a tree, closing her eyes for a moment, the weight of exhaustion pulling at every muscle. Her hands were raw, cut and blooded, her ribs ached with every breath, but her spirit stood taller than ever. She had been tested, pushed to the edge of what any human could endure, and she had not broken. She had shattered the enemy's strength, shattered their commander, and carried proof of the darkness they had built in secret. The mission was not only survival. It was victory. As dawn spread across the jungle, painting the leaves gold, she opened her eyes again, her gaze sharp, unwavering. The fight was not over, not by a long stretch. What they carried would ignite more battles, more fire, more blood. But for now, they had survived. For now, they had taken what was hidden and dragged it into the light. And in the silence of that moment, broken only by the hum of insects and the breath of her surviving comrades, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. No weapon in the world could be as powerful as the will that refused to break. The end.